Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak to the throne speech and to the amendment made by the Leader of the Opposition. First, I'd like to recognize the recent devastation left by the Haiyan typhoon in the Philippines. It's hard for us to comprehend the extent of the destruction and the number of people who have been left homeless and without sufficient access to food and to shelter. It's important that we are reaching out to our friends in the Philippine community to offer what emotional and financial support we can under these very stressful circumstances. I also want to share my sympathies with our friends south of the border for the devastation left by the recent tornadoes and the severe thunderstorms in the Midwest United States, with, of course, the most severe being in Illinois. Our hearts go out to them as they engage in the recovery from these severe weather events. And I want as well to recognize that this week is Holodomor Awareness Week. It's important that we're all aware of the devastating genocide and famine in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. It's also important that we learn from this and other genocides the reasons for what happened and why it happened, and that we act effectively to prevent such genocides from ever occurring again in the future. I want to say a thank you to the residents of River Heights who elected me and who I represent. River Heights is a wonderful, friendly community with many outstanding people, like Jim Carson, Bev Lamore, and Aradunca, who were recognized earlier this year with the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medals.
Just table them, John.
Our resilient and lively community spirit is reflected in our Kelvin Clippers and Grant Park Pirates football teams and the many Corridon Comets teams who continue to play hard. The River Heights community is also home to the Chai Folk Ensemble, the only Israeli folk ensemble in North America to perform exclusively to live music, a vehicle for continuing Jewish culture through music and dance in Canada. They are now preparing for their 50th anniversary next year, and I anticipate a fantastic celebration. Mr. Speaker, I want to reflect for a moment on why we're here. We are here to represent and to care for the people of our province. We are the servants of the people. It is in this context that it's of great concern that under this NDP government, Manitoba middle-income families have continually been left behind over the last 14 years, with two-income and single-parent families watching their incomes disappear in a myriad of taxes and increasing costs. The majority of Manitoba's workers, the backbone of our province, are being squeezed. Sadly, while the throne speeches of the last 14 years have made many flimsy promises, this government has delivered little for hard-working Manitobans. The status of Manitoba families has hardly changed. Manitoba's middle-income earners have consistently experienced a flat line in their disposable incomes after inflation, year after year. Indeed, for far too many, incomes are not even keeping up with inflation. Manitoba families are feeling frustrated, financially squeezed, and worried about slipping backward as they try to keep a roof over their heads and feed their families. After 14 years of neglecting families in Manitoba, the NDP have conditioned Manitobans to only hope, but not expect any improvement from this government. We had little expectation for anything other than the status quo in this throne speech, and on this, the NDP have delivered again. Manitobans would have liked to have seen a throne speech that offered real hope for rising incomes and greater opportunities for Manitoba families. Alas, we didn't. The major focus of this throne speech was on infrastructure, on spending on what the Premier has coined core infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, more than 7 months ago, when the government presented its budget, the primary focus of the budget was on raising the provincial sales tax by 1%, from 7% to 8%. Mr. Speaker, since April, the Premier and his Cabinet have attempted many explanations for how the money raised by the extra 1% on the PST, which they've been collecting since July, how that money will be spent. I've estimated that there have been about 50 different proposals. And last week, on Tuesday, in the throne speech, the government provided their 51st, again a vague and unfocused option for spending the money. In presenting their various options, this NDP government began by saying it would be spent on infrastructure, and then began by talking about infrastructure as roads and bridges and flood prevention. But they also extended this to include schools and hospitals. And then over the course of the last 7.5 months, the government issued a series of announcements, using each to reflect on how this road or back lane or recreational center or school or playground or house was an example of how they were spending the new money from the increased provincial sales tax. Indeed, as the days and weeks passed, soon the government was talking about items which weren't infrastructure at all, as if the PST increase, which remains without the legally required referendum approval from Manitobans, as if this increase was there for anything and everything that the government was asking. Manitobans very quickly became skeptical about the rise in the PST and the large number of claims that were being made for why the PST was increased. Since then, last Tuesday, after about 50 proposals in one form or another as to what the rise in the PST was for, the government decided that core infrastructure was the buzzword of the moment, meaning that the vast majority of things that they claimed to be spending it on over the last 7.5 months was actually just misleading Manitobans. For reasons known only to themselves, the NDP government have led the people of Manitoba on a tortuous journey, to the point where, quite frankly, no one in Manitoba really knew where they were going to spend the PST money on. Indeed, we were to find out in the 2 weeks before the throne speech that the government had covered such a tortuous path that they themselves had forgotten what they were going to spend the PST money on. And as a result, members of the government decided that since they didn't know for sure, they had to ask some people. And so they invited a wide variety of people in meetings in the run-up to the throne speech, so that after 7.5 months of telling people what they were spending the money on, they were going to do a complete about-face and ask people what they thought. And so as a result of this process, the NDP government has come forward in its throne speech to say that they will spend the money on infrastructure, core infrastructure, they say. But because of the circuitous path the government has taken, and their recent conversion to the idea that they should only spend it on core infrastructure, we are left with a question. We ask, why should the latest option for spending the PST money be any more credible than any of the 50 which preceded it? To top off their statement in the throne speech about spending the PST money on core infrastructure, the government has thrown out a number, $5.5 billion, that the provincial government now says it will spend in the next 5 years on core infrastructure. This is an interesting figure, particularly given that the government will likely only raise about $1.4 billion in the last 5 years from the increase in the first 5 years from the increase in the PST from 7 to 8%. The $1.4 billion represents about $200 million in 2013-2014 and an average of about $300 million in each of the next 4 years. Now, $5.5 billion is about 4 times $1.4 billion. And in the information provided by the government, it's become apparent that they are including dollars provided by the federal government and dollars provided by municipalities. But no, the Premier in a media scrum said that every penny spent was to be spent by the provincial government, though in some cases they would, of course, rather be pleased if the federal government would consider reimbursing them for their expenditures. So much for the federal government being a partner. The federal government is just there for reimbursement. As I mentioned Monday in question period, the Premier has often taken the position that taxpayers' money is his money to do with as he wishes. And now, in taking the position that federal and municipal dollars are also his money to do with as he wishes, the Premier has moved to a new level. His claims over the money he's spending, which is not just from Manitoba provincial taxpayers, but from municipal taxpayers and federal taxpayers as well. Mr. Speaker, infrastructure is important, and so, of course, is spending every cent of taxpayers' money wisely and with honesty. The people of Manitoba have been and will continue to watch. The Premier and his government have a record of overspending. Whether the Premier will spend wisely or not, we will be watching closely. It is, of course, of interest that this NDP government says in the throne speech that it's committed to working with the municipalities on asset management plans to maximize the life of local infrastructure. This optimization of spending and efforts to ensure infrastructure lasts and lasts are vital and are elements that we've been calling for some time. But I will begin by asking this question. Is the province actually optimally managing its own infrastructure, let alone trying to manage the municipality's infrastructure? Let me give you one small example. As Manitobans know, for many years I've been calling on the province to change from a drain, drain, drain approach to water management to an approach which balances water retention with drainage so that water is not continually coming off the land faster and faster. There is at South Tobacco Creek an example of the water retention behind 27 small dams, which reduces the peak flow off the land by 25%. This is a good infrastructure management because reducing the peak flow has increased the lifespan of road and culvert infrastructure and decreased the damage to this infrastructure. Instead of changing their approach to water management, the province has continued its drain, drain, drain approach, which results in greater damage to infrastructure and a shortened infrastructure lifespan. The province needs to get its act together first before it preaches to municipalities. In another example, the province has included in its list of priority infrastructure a redevelopment of the Daly Overpass on 18th Street in Brandon. Now, this is actually very important to the people of Brandon, but the project appears to be getting announced without the normal engineering and traffic planning studies, which would be expected to precede such an effort. There have been proposals put forward which might be more effective in addressing the congestion issues at much less cost, which do not appear to have been fully evaluated. We would expect much better planning than this. It appears that the Premier is so keen for a photo op. He's jumping in with an announcement without having done the sort of due diligence and homework he's calling out the municipalities for not doing. In summary, while infrastructure is to be supported, like all other government expenditures, well, not all under the NDP, I must say, infrastructure spending must be subject to due diligence and care and wisdom, all items which the current NDP government seems to have a rather short supply of. The third area I'd like to discuss is the fact that the current NDP government has sadly and epically failed in many major areas over the course of the last 14 years. With this record of failure, one has to be at least skeptical of the grandiose plans put forward by the Premier, plans which already appear to be short on proper planning and due diligence. One thing that can be said about the NDP failures is that they followed a balanced approach, failing on fiscal management, failing on social spending, and failing on environmental stewardship, failing on everything. First, on fiscal management. When the NDP government came to power in 1999, they promised to balance the budget. In 2008, because this NDP government had failed to put Manitoba's fiscal house in order, they passed legislation so they'd only have to balance the budget every 4 years. In 2010, they failed to keep even this watered-down promise, and again legislation was changed to allow the government to excuse their own failures. After 14 years of failures, Mr. Speaker, one has to ask why on earth would the people of Manitoba now trust the NDP government to honour their current fiscal promises. It's too bad that Manitoba families, those being squeezed out of their hard-earned dollars, can't just rewrite the rules every time they feel that squeeze, thanks to the NDP government. Second, on social policy. When the Broadbent Institute recently rated provincial governments for delivering on social well-being to their populations, Manitoba was found to be at the bottom of the barrel. Manitoba, under this NDP government, has done very poorly on such basic measures as infant mortality and educational scores compared to other provinces. The NDP government can hardly blame the organization which gave them this rating, since the Broadbent Institute has solid NDP credentials, and if anything would be more likely to give this NDP government a break. To their credit, the Broadbent Institute was honest and forthright. It would be a nice surprise if this NDP government emulated the Broadbent Institute in this respect. Middle-class families in Manitoba are concerned about social policy, and they're concerned that dollars to help those in need of social services are well spent. The failure of the NDP government to provide an increase in shelter rates to 75% of market rates, or any policy reflective of true costs of living in this province, stands out as one of the ignominious actions or lack of actions of any government anywhere. The failure of this government to recognize real-world costs actually exists is reflective of the fact that this NDP government doesn't really concern itself with real-world markets and costs. Not long ago, at a committee meeting in the legislature, we heard from people in Brandon that there has not been any rental accommodation available in Brandon at the level of support provided under income assistance, $285 a month. There has been no rental accommodation available since the year 2000 in Brandon at that price. The government is forcing people to take money for their children's food in order to pay the rent. The children are suffering, and we are suffering as a society because these children are growing up poor, malnourished, and with a lack of opportunities that other children have. The NDP policies are short-sighted, outdated, ineffective, and uncaring approaches to social policy, and the results are reflected in the recent rating by the Broadbent Institute. Furthermore, on one area of social policy, health, and the management of emergency rooms, the throne speech was silent in spite of the poor management during the last 14 years and the need for improvement. Third, Mr. Speaker, on environmental issues, this government is also failing. Mr. Speaker, today Lake Winnipeg is still the most threatened lake on our planet. Yet in 2003, this NDP government said they'd clean up Lake Winnipeg in 2 or 3 years. The year before that, in 2002, this NDP government said they'd meet. Indeed, they promised to exceed their Kyoto targets by 2010. This was later put in legislation. Of course, they delayed the target till 2012. Now, just last year, the Premier had to acknowledge his failure in keeping even this belated commitment as well. The throne speech gives Lake Winnipeg only a small mention. There's no real plan to improve Lake Winnipeg presented. The government has talked for some time of a new water management plan, but this was notably lacking in the throne speech. The government continues with its troubled drain, drain, drain approach to water management and fails to recognize the need to change to an approach which balances drainage with water retention in a way that doesn't continually increase the amount of water coming off the land. The government's present drain, drain, drain approach has increased flooding and has increased the amount of phosphorus going into Lake Winnipeg. Further, with climate change and increased amounts of wet weather, the old ways are not what's needed today. The government has reneged on meeting its Kyoto targets, even though these were put in legislation. And in this throne speech, there's no plan for where the government will be heading in the future. Having covered 3 principal themes, the lack of this government's support for families, their confusing policies on infrastructure, and their failures on fiscal management, on social policy, on environmental stewardship, I now want to move on to talk about various additional issues and claims which the government itself has made in its throne speech. First, on childcare and early childhood education. This NDP government throne speech claimed, for our government, Manitoba families are always the main priority. Yet this is clearly one of the most vacuous claims in the throne speech. It is important that this is exposed for the reality that the NDP government has in fact done a very poor job of supporting families. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the poor support this government has provided for childcare and early childhood education in Manitoba for all families. As was revealed in a panel discussion organized by the Child Care Coalition in Manitoba on September 18th, there's a crisis in the child care system in Manitoba, with very long waiting times for access in our province and more than 11,000 children waiting. At the present time, there are only enough spaces for about 20% of Manitoba children in the preschool years. In Quebec, the number is about 50%. And in Scandinavia, I understand it is higher, around 80%. We are only 40% as far as Quebec. The prolonged waits for access are preventing many middle-class mothers from working. This is putting brakes on our economy, as well as hampering the needs and aspirations of ordinary families all over Manitoba. And yet in the throne speech, the NDP do not even recognize the current desperate situation. We have a long way to catch up to where we need to be, and this government has presented no plan. Ordinary Manitoba families are just not a priority for this NDP government. On children, further addressing important issues for children, such as early childhood tooth decay, improved learning, improved childhood behavior, and decreasing violence, needs to be substantially improved in the approach that's being taken provincially. Similarly, there's a need to improve the Child and Family Services system so that families and children are better supported, and so that fewer children are apprehended and taken into care. 10,000 children in care is far too many, yet inexplicably on this, the throne speech has no plan. Diabetes. In its throne speech, the government claims success in relation to diabetes, saying that the number of people being diagnosed with diabetes has declined. Well, the government is referring to a recent report from the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. The statement made in the throne speech is not accurate. The number of people being diagnosed with diabetes has actually increased, and this comes from Manitoba Health's own numbers. It is only when the data is adjusted to give an age-adjusted figure that there's a very slight decline in age-adjusted numbers. Even then, the incidence figure now, age-adjusted, is much higher than it was 10 years ago. Indeed, the overall incidence of diabetes in Manitoba is unacceptably high, reflecting the disastrous and abysmal policies of the NDP government with respect to the diabetes epidemic. As we've pointed out, an effective approach to the epidemic under this government would have produced a very different result, preventing up to 30,000 new cases of diabetes and saving the provincial government up to $600 million over the last 14 years. By now, this could have eased the tax burden, as well as improving the health of middle-class families, and all families. Indeed, sadly, when it comes to diabetes, the current Premier and his NDP government must rank as having done a very poor job, another NDP failure. Well, progress on rapid transit, as announced in the throne speech and this week, is welcome to Manitoba families. It's come all too slowly under this government. It's taken 14 years to have 3.6 kilometers of rapid transit, getting our university students, staff, and faculty halfway to where they're trying to go. Once again, the throne speech falls short of where it should be, and it could have done better, and we should have been there sooner, all the way by now. Innovation. The throne speech talks of the importance of innovation and commercialization of new ideas. It's not enough, Mr. Speaker, just to talk about innovation. Over the course of the last year and a half, drastic changes have occurred in Manitoba with respect to our innovation capacity. With the loss of the Institute of Biodiagnostics, the loss of the Cereals Research Laboratory, and the loss of significant agricultural research capacity, to name a few. The Premier and his NDP government have been pretty quiet on these losses and have been ineffective in ensuring a strong future for grains research, and have failed to achieve their promised coming together of the Canadian National Grains Institute, the Cereal Research Lab, and the research activity at the Canadian Grains Institute. We're looking at long-term repercussions, negative repercussions for the future of the grain industry and the future of our province. Innovation and commercialization of innovations is important for middle-class jobs, but the government has managed to leave us short of a meaningful action plan in the throne speech. Privatization of the property registry. In the same throne speech that the Premier and his government talk of the failed policies of privatization and elsewhere in the throne speech, the government talks of how it has privatized Manitoba's property registry. They say we partnered with the private sector to develop a new model for delivering property registry services. What is very clear from the way the government has privatized the property registry is that the NDP are not business people. The failure to tender the sale of the property registry It's incomprehensible unless one recognizes that the Premier and his NDP government seem to know very little about normal business practices, like tendering for a major sale like this one. The extra costs that will have to be paid by all Manitoba families to access necessary information is obviously not a concern for this NDP government. From the example of how the same company is operated in Ontario, we can expect very high prices here in Manitoba and poor service all at the same time, all the result of the NDP giving a monopoly to an Ontario company without ever tendering the sale in the first place. It is likely that one day there will be an auditor's report on this sale, and it's likely to not be very complimentary to the NDP, just as the auditor's report in Ontario was not very complimentary to this company. Mr. Speaker, in summary, Liberals will not support this throne speech. It is far short of what Manitoba families need. It is far short of what our province needs. Thank you.